There's a lot of survivor-style games out there. You've got your fantasy ones, your sci-fi ones, your indie experiments that throw 50 power-ups at you until you're basically a walking blender of death. But Denrei Survivors, this one stands out before you've even pressed start. It's Cyberpunk Tokyo, lit up in neon and rubble, swarming not with zombies or demons, but with middle-aged men. Not just any men, Denrei electric spirits born from a lightning strike that fried the Tokyo Skytree and warped reality overnight. And in the middle of this chaos, you, a lone high school girl, somehow still breathing when the rest of the city's gone ghost. No squad, no safety net, just a strange ability to harness the same energy that created the Denrei. You don't just fight them, you turn their own power against them, building yourself into an unstoppable force run after run. If you've played Vampire Survivors, you'll know the basic rhythm here. Enemies keep coming, weapons keep stacking, and you're always one upgrade away from turning the battlefield into a glowing storm of chaos. But Denrei Survivors takes that formula and drops it into a world where the enemies aren't just fodder, they're part of the story's weird charm. Every one of these middle-aged spirit men comes at you in relentless waves, sometimes goofy, sometimes unsettling, always pushing you to keep moving. The game thrives on unpredictability. The dungeons are procedurally generated, so you're never retracing the same paths. Sometimes you'll get a weapon early that makes you feel invincible, until the next wave wipes the smirk off your face. Other times, you're scraping by with whatever scraps the RNG hands you, weaving between enemies like your life depends on it. Because it does. That randomness forces you to adapt in real time, which is where the roguelite part really kicks in. And it's not just the weapons themselves, it's how you chain them together. One run, you might be spamming a long-range laser that pierces everything. Next run, you're up close and personal with short-range burst damage, praying your movement speed upgrades kick in before the Denrei box you in. It's the kind of gameplay loop that makes you say, all right, just one more run at 2 a.m., and then you're still there at 4. But Denrei Survivors isn't all gameplay grind, it's dripping with style. The pixel art is sharp and detailed. From the flicker of neon signs in the background to the absurd, slightly tragic expressions on the Denrei enemies. The cyberpunk setting isn't just for looks. It's part of what makes the whole premise feel surreal and fresh. Tokyo feels like a city that's halfway alive, buzzing with both electricity and danger. The humor here is another thing you can't ignore. A lot of roguelites lean on moodiness or high fantasy tropes, but this game knows it's a little ridiculous and leans into it. The idea of these ghostly middle-aged men, dressed like they just stepped out of a convenience store, charging you in hordes is hilarious in its own offbeat way. And then you've got your protagonist, a high school girl facing down this madness with a mix of determination and absurd weapon loadouts. It's so strange it works. Underneath the silliness, though, there's a constant sense of pressure. The game doesn't really let you relax. Every wave ramps up, enemies multiply. And before you know it, you're dodging electric projectiles, weaving through tight corridors, trying to grab that one health pickup without getting swarmed. The tension never fully leaves, which is exactly why it's so satisfying when you pull off a perfect escape or melt an entire crowd in seconds. And while the premise is wild, the structure keeps you coming back. You're always working toward a better build, finding new weapon and item combos, and figuring out how to make the RNG work in your favor. It's about mastery, but it's also about embracing the chaos. That's where Denrei Survivors hooks you. Each run feels like a story, even if the plot is just you figuring out how to survive 5 seconds longer than last time. By the time you've been through a few runs, you're not just playing for upgrades, you're playing for moments. That perfect synergy where your weapons sync up, and the screen becomes a blur of lightning and explosions. That close call where you're down to 1 hit point, boxed into a corner, and somehow carve your way out. The laugh you get when you notice some small animation detail you missed before. It's the kind of game that's just as much about the ride as it is about the win. Denrei Survivors doesn't try to reinvent every wheel in the survivor genre, but it doesn't need to. What it does is take a tried-and-true formula, wrap it in a setting you won't forget, and give it an identity that's both ridiculous and weirdly compelling. Cyberpunk Tokyo, electric ghost men, a lone schoolgirl fighting them off with their own stolen power. It's fast, it's chaotic, and it's exactly the kind of game you'll boot up thinking you've got time for one run, and then lose your whole evening to.